Now, if you had to guess 4 words that were most common to a family road trip, what do you think it would be? Are we there yet? Right? How far? That's good. How much longer? Those are all kind of tied together. I think it would be, are we there yet? I know my kids, they'll ask that question. They'll ask, like we have the thing where it'll show a GPS on, and they'll say, turn the GPS on, I want to see how much longer we have. And they'll still say, are we there yet? And so I like to tell my kids, yeah, we are here. We're just still driving for no reason at all. And of course they love the sarcasm. But I'm not sure if they teach kids that at an early age, or if we're all kind of born with that idea of are we there yet? To me, are we there yet seems more fitting for when you're hiking. Because, if your legs are getting tired, or maybe your back or things like that, if they're aching, then you might think like, man, are we there yet? I'm really tired. In a car, you're just kind of rolling. And we get tired of riding, but that's a funny question. And a lot of times, I think the other side of that is if the trip itself weren't enough, with people getting kind of frustrated and tired of riding and saying, are we there yet? There's always the possibility that once you get there, still people won't be satisfied once they get there. One time, our family, just from a personal experience, our family went to the happiest place on earth, and we even brought Grandma because it was going to be a great time, and Grandma could help us out with our kids. They were a little younger, and there's a picture of us. That was a few years ago. And after hours of walking and riding rides, we paused for a bit to wait for the fireworks. We thought, okay, the kids are getting tired. This is a good time just to kind of relax and rest a little bit before the evening continues. And our kids started complaining. Then they started fighting with one another. I'm sure your kids never did that. That's just my kids. And I looked at them and kind of half joking and maybe even a little serious. I said, we spent a lot of money and time for you to be here and to be happy. Now start acting happy. Often the gap between expectations and reality come into view on trips and vacations. And as we turn our attention from our trips to a trip that the people of God were on as they escaped the slavery of Egypt, we see similar things taking place, except they weren't necessarily going to Disney World. They're going to another happiest place on earth known as the Promised Land. And I think as the novelty and the excitement of coming out of known slavery it kind of takes a transition into worrying about where in the world they're going. What are they going to do for all of the things that they need? And even there turns into some anger as they move into the unknown. Now, this is week 2 of our series that we're called, coincidentally, Into the Unknown, which is designed to have us see both the story of God in Exodus as well as the character of God that still invites you and me to join with Him today in the unknown of tomorrow. Now, last week we discussed how the Israelites, God's people, had ended up in slavery in Egypt. We kind of went through how that happened, and that their place of blessing turned into a place of bondage or slavery. Now, when you read the first 14 chapters of Exodus, you'll read about Moses and the burning bush, some stories where most of us are familiar with. There's the 10 plagues that changed the mind of Pharaoh, and even the parting of the Red Sea. I mean, right out of the gate, there's a great miracle happening as they come out, and we see this parting of the Red Sea. And God continually makes a way for His people to experience new life in His presence as He continues to make a way. And so we're going to pick up that story today in Exodus 15 and 16. And what we find as we jump into here is reality is starting to sink in for this nation of people that are on the move. And so Exodus chapter 15, beginning in the 22nd verse, here's what we read. Then Moses led the people of Israel away from the Red Sea, and they moved out into the desert of Shur. They traveled in the desert for 3 days without finding any water. When they came to the oasis of Marah, the water was too bitter to drink, so they called the place Marah, which means bitter. Then the people complained and turned against Moses. What are we going to drink? They demanded. Now, I don't know if you caught that in the very first part of that passage, but how many days did it say that they were from the parting of the Red Sea? 3. 3 days from like the biggest miracle they probably had ever seen. I mean, the plagues were one thing, but then to have a whole sea come up beside of you, split down the middle, and have you walk through. I mean, can you imagine the awe and just the spectacular nature of that? And it only took 3 days for that to fade away. Because already they're turning against Moses. They aren't saying necessarily, are we there yet? But it does seem rather short to you for them to get impatient. Do you think? Maybe they thought they'd be teleported. I don't know. Maybe they thought it was just on the other side of the Red Sea. That this land that was promised to their family, that they would just poof, be there. But the journey from who they were to the people that God is calling them into being doesn't just happen overnight. Now, God provides a way for them to drink water there. You can read about that in the rest of that chapter. But we're going to move into the next chapter, chapter 16, as the story continues. And here's what we read, starting in verse 1. Then the whole community of Israel set out from Elim and journeyed into the wilderness of Sin, between Elim and Sinai. They arrived there on the 15th day of the second month, 1 month after leaving the land of Egypt. There, too, the whole community of Israel complained about Moses and Aaron. If only the Lord had killed us back in Egypt, they moaned. There we sat around pots filled with meat and ate all the bread we wanted, but now you have brought us into the wilderness to starve us to death. Can you imagine that? They're saying, now you have brought us into this place to starve us to death. I don't know what happened to my next thing. Oops. All right, there we go. Sorry, I lost my place. But they were 1 month out from coming out of Egypt. What was that, 27 days from coming through the Red Sea. And it only took 1 month for some vocal people on this ancient family trip that are ready to trade back their freedom to go back to the slavery that they had known. Now, you could say, well, maybe it was just a bad day. You know, maybe the sun was extra hot. Maybe they had extra sand stuck in their sandals. Maybe they got a rock or something in their toe. Who really knows? But they're saying, why did you bring us here to die? God provides manna, if you know the story. Food that would appear daily. So did the complaining stop? What do you think? Yes, right? They were satisfied. No, they weren't. The complaining didn't stop. Numbers chapter 11, verse 4 through 5. Then the foreign rabble who were traveling with the Israelites began to crave the good things of Egypt, and the people of Israel began to complain. Oh, for some meat, they exclaimed. We remember the fish we used to eat for free in Egypt, and we had all the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic we wanted. But now our appetites are gone. All we ever see is this manna. First it was we didn't have any food. Now it's the food we have we don't like. And I like this verse 10. Moses heard all the families standing in their doorways of their tents whining, and the Lord became extremely angry. Moses was also very aggravated. Can you imagine being aggravated in a situation like that? I mean, have you ever gotten frustrated or aggravated when people just keep complaining? Surely not. I know I have. But at times, sometimes it's like, is anything ever enough? Is it ever good enough? God and Moses paid a lot for the people to be there, and he's like, be happy with what you get. And rather than trusting Moses, and especially trusting God, the people complained and wanted to go back to what they had known, even if it meant they were back into slavery. Well, maybe this was the last of their bad days, right? Nope, probably not. Numbers chapter 20. There was no water for the people to drink at that place, so they rebelled against Moses and Aaron. The people blamed Moses and said, if only we had died in the Lord's presence with our brothers. Why have you brought the congregation of the Lord's people into the wilderness to die, along with all of our livestock? Why did you make us leave Egypt and bring us here to this terrible place? This land has no grain, no figs, no grapes, no pomegranates, and no water to drink. Phew. The list of complaints doesn't seem to go away. And this is a pattern of behavior we start to see. I'm sure not every single time the people complained did they get out their pen or their chisel or their pen, whatever, and start recording down what happened. But instead, I think what we see is a pattern of behavior where the people that God has invited into a covenant relationship are just fed up, impatient, wanting to know all the answers, not happy with the answers that they're given, but just like, I need to know more. When things get tough and they have the opportunity to entrust their unknowns of the reality to their God, who wants to be known by them and invites them to know him and to be known, they look to eject because the circumstances around them don't meet their expectations. And it's funny how quickly they forget the circumstances back in Egypt because they're saying, let's just go back to Egypt. At least I knew what to expect there. And regardless of the identity that Egypt gave them, make no mistake about it, their God, Yahweh, had wanted to change their identity. His covenant that he offered them was for them to be known as the people of Yahweh. He said, I will be your God and you will be my what? People. It's an invitation saying, we will be known as one together. It's like when you get married. You form an identity as a couple. Some people even change their name because it symbolizes, hey, we are together. Now we're still two separate individuals, but we're not separate. We're actually unified together. And so it's the same kind of thing, is that there's an invitation to join and be known together as Yahweh's people. There's an invitation into the continual presence of Yahweh, but it's contingent on the terms of the covenant partnership. It's like a marriage, right? There are certain things that you do and don't do if you're married. Hopefully I don't have to go through those things with you. You know them, right? Like there are things that you do and you don't do. And the same thing with a relationship with Yahweh is there are things that you do and you don't do to signify. That's why the first two commandments are what? Do you know the first commandment?
Honor the Lord your God with your whole heart and soul.
Yeah. And the second commandment? Have no other gods. What is that? That sounds like a marriage covenant too, doesn't it? In sickness and in health be married and have no other bays. No, have no other boyfriends, girlfriends, other people, right? It's a singular devotion to that thing. And that's the same thing that's going on here. It's saying we will form a unity, a unifying relationship where we are known by one another, but it's contingent on those terms. Now, journeying forward, he's saying we will go together as one, where Yahweh is the provider and the leader for the people, and where he takes care of his people. He's saying, come with me and I will take care of you, but I can only do that if your lives and your hearts are entrusted to me. And so I need you to give me your devotion, I need you to follow me, but I need you to give me your heart and love me as well. He's inviting us into a relationship, a very personal, intimate relationship, and that's what the covenant is. But what we see in these accounts that we just read through is that their hearts are longing for the comforts of Pharaoh in Egypt. Even if, back with Pharaoh in Egypt, they were defined by their work. And so what we have here in the wilderness is a dichotomy of identities, and they are in conflict. They are conflicted. You ever heard somebody say that? I'm really conflicted. I want to be this, but I feel like I'm this. Or I want to also be this. That's what's going on here. You have the old identity, which is the identity provided under Pharaoh in Egypt, and it says, you have value and you have worth on a practical level alone. By that it means your worth is tied to your ability to make bricks. Right? That would make sense. If you're a slave, what do you have a slave for? To look pretty or to get to work? Get to work, right? And so what Pharaoh said is, you have value as long as you can make bricks for me. Pharaoh will feed you, Pharaoh will house you, and he will take care of you as long as you can produce. If you aren't able to work, if you aren't able to make a brick, if you aren't a brick maker, then what are you? To Pharaoh, you're nobody. You're worthless. What good is a slave that can't work? Will he continue to take care of you? No. I would call that a practical or a utilitarian view of human beings that says they are only worth something when they do something of worth. To Pharaoh, people are only what they can do. If they cannot do something, if they cannot produce something, they have lost their reason for existing. Recently, my family and I, we went back to Ohio, where Don and my family both are from. We went back to Ohio for the holiday. We were listening to an audiobook of C.S. Lewis's Magician's Nephew, and it's from the Chronicles of Narnia. And in that story, there's a witch named Jadis, and she lives in a world called Charn. And there's not going to be a quiz on this, so you don't have to remember this. I'm just giving you some context for it. And she basically, like as you read the story, she kind of represents the devil in the story. Now, the two main characters in The Magician's Nephew are children. Their names are Polly and Diggory. I don't know where they get that name from. It's an interesting name. But anyway, these are these two kids, and they meet Jadis, and they accidentally bring her into their world from Charn. Now, she immediately befriends Diggory's uncle and sends the uncle on an errand. And that, at that point, is where I'm dropping you into this excerpt we're going to read. It says, "Now that Jadis was left alone with the children, she took no notice of either of them. And that was like her too. In Charn, she had taken no notice of Polly till the very end, because Diggory was the one she wanted to make use of. Now that she had Uncle Andrew, she took no notice of Diggory." And the author says, "I expect most witches are like that. They are not interested in things or people unless they can use them. They are terribly practical." I don't know that Pharaoh was a witch, but to view people as only as important as long as they can be used, as long as they can do something for you, that is a framework of identity that is shared between those two characters, Pharaoh and Jadis. On the other hand of this, you have Yahweh, who offered a new, different kind of identity for his people. An identity found in relationship with the one who created them and had created the world. The one who rescued them, not because of what they could do or what they could produce, but because of who they are. Under the formatting is really off, I'm sorry, but under the new identity of Yahweh, their worth was no longer tied to what they could or what they couldn't do, but who they were on a journey to becoming in relationship with him. After all, they were not human doings, they are human what? Beings. And so who you are has to do with who you are yourself, not what you do. Now, none of you have probably seen a movie called Anger Management, but there's a movie called Anger Management. I'm not endorsing that you should go out and watch that. But they're interviewing Adam Sandler's character, and it's Jack Nicholson. And so I'm just telling you that because you would never watch it in a million years. But they have this conversation. He says, "Tell us about yourself." And he says, "Well, I'm an accountant, and I do this." And they said, No, you're telling us what you do. And he said, "Who are you?" And he said, "Well, I'm a caring guy. I like to do that." And he said, "I like to play tennis." He's like, No, you're telling us about your character. You're not telling us who you are." And he gets really frustrated and says, "I don't know what you want me to answer with. Maybe this guy. Can you give me an example of an answer?" And they say, "You want him to tell you who you are?" But that's the problem. A lot of us don't know who we are outside of what we do, and that is framed under the mantle or under the heading of Pharaoh. But Yahweh, what he invites us into is a relationship because of who you are, not because of what you do. Yahweh offered to be what the people trusted for their water, for their food, and even their survival. He said, "Trust in me and I will provide for you." And they're saying, "How?" And he's saying, "Just trust in me and it will happen." And so what you have this pattern of is they're saying, the circumstances aren't right, fix the circumstances. And God knows that just by fixing the circumstances, they won't become better people. They'll just fix that circumstance and they'll be unhappy down the road, right? That's why they said, "We have no water," he gives them water. They said, "We have no food," he gives them manna. And then he said, "We don't have meat," and he gives them quail. And then they're still complaining. Because they want fixed circumstances and he's trying to fix their hearts. And so what Yahweh is saying, if you trust me, come into relationship with me, I will feed, I will clothe, and I will house you because you are my people. Not because you earned it by your work, but he offers them an identity because of their relationship with him. And any work they did was free to be that. Just work. It's something they did. If they couldn't make bricks, what were they? They were still a child of the Creator and King of the universe. They had the freedom in Yahweh, but they had a lot of unknowns. Right? They didn't know where they're going. They didn't know where they're going to get water from. They didn't know where they're going to get food from. And so what did that require of them? It required of them to trust his promises. Now they had slavery with Pharaoh, But they knew exactly what they'd get, didn't they? Have you ever met someone that said, well, my job's horrible, and you're saying, why don't you leave it? And they're saying, well, at least I know the horrible that I'm going to face every day. Some other job has a bunch of unknowns. I'm not saying that's bad or good advice, but that's kind of what's going on here. They knew what they had with Pharaoh. Yeah, it was backbreaking labor, and they cried out to God to get out of there, but then he took them to a situation where they didn't know where they were going. They had to trust him, and they're saying, get me out of here. The only thing they trusted back with Pharaoh was their ability to produce. And they're saying, I'm going to bank on myself to be able to do something. Two different identities. One is a break maker who may or may not believe that Yahweh is God, and the other is united with Yahweh who may or may not make bricks. Do you see the difference? It's like there's a difference between an American who claims to be a Christian and a Christian who happens to be an American. There's a difference, and it's a difference of identity. In the same way that sometimes we allow our work to be our identity. Many of us have been taught or have developed great work ethics, and there's something good about that. There's something nice about that. But too many of us have accepted a Pharaoh practical mindset that have taught us two things. One, that we should get our worth and identity from what we do. When we do more things, we're more valuable because we have more money, we have more success. We can say, hey, I've done all this with my life. What have you done with yours? And the other is that we view others through that lens, and we project it onto other people that says their worth, what they are worth, or their value is tied to what they can or cannot do for me. How many posts have you, I'm sure not all of you are on social media, but if you're on social media, you'll see things like that. Like, I stopped giving to people who can't do anything for me. Well, I hate to break it to those people. They're probably not even here because you people wouldn't think that way. But I hate to break it to that person, but that's a transactional view of people. When I give you something only because I get something from you, we're in a transaction. We're business partners. We're not in a relationship. A relationship cares about people regardless. And that's what Yahweh is offering them. But a Pharaoh mindset says it's only practical that matters. And so when we view others, it says they have no value unless they're a productive member of society, then we have no time for people who aren't contributing. We have no compassion for people who can't help themselves. And we dehumanize people down to whether or not they can be fixed or useful. Right? Some people, they come to like an Alcoholics Anonymous group and they come 400 times and they're saying, I give up on that person, they can't be fixed, but that's not Yahweh. A lot of times, all the while, we're too afraid to face the reality of answering the question, who am I if I can't blank? Who am I if I can't preach? Who am I if I don't have kids? Who am I if I can't walk? Who am I if I can't sing? Who am I if I can't speak? Who am I? And all those things become our reality. Who am I if I can't construct? Who am I if I can't computer program? Who am I if I can't do the things that I do? If I can't work, if I can't do what I used to, if I can't serve a purpose, who am I? Moment of honesty, you don't have to raise your hand, but I know that people have faced that question before. Some people have retired from a job they've worked their whole life and saying, who am I if I don't work that job? And they wrestle with that and they struggle with that. Who am I if I don't do that anymore? Pastor Eugene Peterson reminds us that that is not the view of God that says you only have value when you produce something. He says this, congregation is a company of people defined by their creation in the image of God, living souls, whether they know it or not. They are not problems to be fixed, but mysteries to be honored and revered. He says, a pastor's work is not to fix people, it is to lead people in the worship of God and lead them in living a holy life. That line there, though, people are not something to be fixed. How many people in here are fixers? Someone complains to them and they're saying, I know what you should do. That's called fixing. Or there's a hole in the wall, I'm going to patch it. That's called fixing too. The wall is one thing, a person is another. And sometimes people do need good advice or they need help. But sometimes you solve their issue, but you haven't fixed them because people are not problems to be fixed. They are people made in the image of God. And sometimes sin has so impacted their life that no amount of programs, no amount of anything is going to fix them. They're just always going to need love and compassion. And so the struggle for the Israelites was between what they knew, even in slavery, and the unknown of trusting God and where He would take them. Isn't that the same temptation laid out before Eve in the garden? That she can either know for herself, that's what the serpent tells her, you can know for yourself right and wrong. Know for yourself, and you can decide for yourself what's right and wrong. Or you can trust God and say, I don't really know, I'm just going to trust God. That's the temptation. Right? The temptation to know for ourselves rather than leave it all up to God. In The Magician's Nephew, that same book, the main characters, I said that they had met Jadis, this witch that was like the devil. But I didn't tell you that they didn't just meet her, they actually had awoken her. This happened when they found this great big bell in a castle, and on the bell there was this inscription. It said, "Make your choice, adventurous stranger, strike the bell and bide the danger, or wonder till it drives you mad what would have happened if you had." The temptation that they faced in this story was to strike the bell and find out what would happen, or be caught up in the curiosity of, well, what would have happened if we had done it? Now, in the story, the curiosity is too much for the little boy Diggory, and he hits the bell and he awakens evil. I imagine curiosity for Eve was very similar, because the devil said, you can know if you take of the fruit. You can know. And she's like, oh, so I can know rather than trusting God? And the curiosity was too much. Do you find it odd that there is something within us that longs to live in what we know, even if it leads to if it leads to danger or slavery? I mean, that's what the Israelites were saying. We would rather know what we were going to face back in slavery. And there was something within us. How many times have you said, or how many times have you heard someone say, I just want to know. I just want to know what happened. I just want to know what will happen if this. It'll put my mind at ease. And so that curiosity to know can sometimes lead us into danger rather than just entrusting the knowing to the wisdom of God. Now, He created it all and He sustains it all and has the power to rule it all. But the Israelites are struggling with this exact thing. Their impatience with the journey. Are we there yet? This is boring. This is hard. This isn't quick complaints. All speaks to an anxiety and a worry that Yahweh isn't ultimately good and won't ultimately take care of them. Doesn't it? It says, I don't trust you. The people of Israel had trust issues. There's a guy that does a thing called Bible Project, and he said this about this. He said, Abraham's family is at its best when they stop their scheming and trust God's promise with radical faith. But they have trust issues. They would rather go back to an identity tied to what they do rather than having it tied to the one who could do everything. They were willing to trade freedom for knowing what to expect, even if it was slavery that ultimately led to death. They were very short-sighted. They're saying, at least we won't be hungry all the time, and at least we won't be thirsty, looking for water. We'll just have to work until we die. Friends, you and I have that exact same choice to make. Jesus has come to give us a new identity, tied to our relationship with Him, not to anything else. Now, we live in a day and a time when people are trying to tell you can identify as a bunch of different things. You can tie your identity to your sexuality. You can tie your identity to your political party. You can tie your identity to your gender. But those things don't really tell you who you are. Jesus says, I came to tell you who you are and to let you live into who you are. Paul speaks to this in Romans chapter 6 when he says this, we know that our old sinful selves were crucified with Christ so that sin might lose its power in our lives. For we are no longer slaves to sin. For when we died with Christ, we are set free from the power of sin. So you also should consider yourselves to be dead to the power of sin and alive to God through Christ Jesus. Do not let sin control the way you live. Do not give in to sinful desires. Sin is no longer your master, for you no longer live under the requirements of the law. Instead, you live under the freedom of God's grace. That's the exact same picture that's happened in Exodus. Is Yahweh saying, you don't go back to Egypt and live under that. You don't have to. You've been freed from that. Can you imagine coming to the Red Sea, having it part and saying, I don't know what's out there. I'm good. So many of us wouldn't do that maybe in that situation, but we do that with sin and the life that we used to live. We come to Jesus and say, hey, get me when I die, and I'm going to continue to live the way that I've lived. But Paul says we've been freed from the power of sin, no longer give in to sinful desires. Jesus is calling you to a new identity, not where you participate in sin, the same sin you did when you were under the power of that, but instead by the power of God. And so if you are surrendered to a life in Jesus, you are no longer defined by what you earn, but instead you are defined by the grace of God, and you are defined by being His people and entrusting our lives to Him. And so your identity is tied to who you are in Him and who you are becoming by His powerful grace. In Christ, your value is not tied to what you can do, and neither is anybody else's. The church has not always been great at this, just to be honest. I'm not saying this church, I'm saying the church, like the church universal. We love people who can help out. We love people who can pitch in. We love people who can sing. We love people who can preach. And it's almost like once they can no longer do those things, then we don't have time for them. But that's not the way that God operates. That's the way of Pharaoh. And what you find out is we were using people for what we wanted to accomplish. That's different than being in partnership with people for the mission of God. There's a difference. One is saying, you're only valuable to this church. You're only valuable to our flock as long as you can do A, B, and C. But if you can't do that, then what use do I have for you? That's why we care about the sick and the infirm. That's why the church has always been an advocate for people with disabilities, and we don't abort pregnancies because someone might come out and they might be useless. Right? Because we are not what we do. We are God's. We are created in His image. And we have value because of the artist or the creator who made us, not because of what we can produce. Does that mean we just sit back and get fat being lazy? No. He invites us to all the things. Was He inviting the Israelites just to sit back and say, well, just sit back and the cart will take you there? No, there's a partnership of saying, okay, we're going this way and it might be difficult, but trust me, it's going to be okay. So friends, who are you? What is your identity? Maybe today God's been saying to you, can you trust me? Because that's really what this whole thing is about. Can you trust God and His promises to see you through? Or do you need to run back to what you know? Do you need to have a grip on everything and say, I know where my next meal is coming from. I know where this is coming from. I mean, sometimes you get down to brass tacks. We're very practical people, aren't we? And when people say things like, well, I'm going to quit this job and go do this other thing, we're saying, what? How are you going to provide for yourself? We ask all the practical questions. How are you going to provide for yourself? How are you going to find meals? How are you going to live? How are you going to do this? We never ask, maybe we do, but it seems like we don't care so much about, did God tell you that? Are you following His call? Because God's question to us all the time is, can you trust me in this? Not just can you trust me with your afterlife, can you trust me with your today life? Can you trust me with your life on the other side of what you know and what you see? Can you trust God to tell you who you are? Can you trust God to tell you what you don't know? I know that's groundbreaking for some of us because we think we know everything. But can you be all right not knowing all the answers, but just knowing the one who does? Can you trust God for where He's taking you without screaming, are we there yet? Because I'm going to tell you, as long as you have breath in your lungs and you're above the ground, we're not there yet. God has work to do in you and through you. But the question is, can you trust him? The question is, will you trust him? It's one thing to sing songs about him. It's another thing to live a life for him. There's nothing wrong with singing. I'm not very good at it, but those two things go together. God's got a purpose for each of us. And his invitation is to come and be known fully and to know him fully. He's not going to give you all the answers. Most of the time, the life of following Jesus is like walking backwards, in that you get to see it as it goes by you and say, oh, I see now how that all worked out. It didn't make sense at the time, but now I have the luxury of history to look back and saying, God was there. He was present and he moved me through. Can you imagine this testimony? We read this testimony of the Israelites and say, manna, which we don't even really know what it was. They try to describe it, but I don't know. Good luck trying to define that. Manna just shows up every day. That's a testimony for us, but it became a complaint for them. Sometimes in our life, we get so accustomed to those things, we're saying, God, I want more. And he's saying, I'm giving you enough to get by. Can you trust me? That's the question. Will you stand with me? Let's pray. Heavenly